Vi satt runt köksbordet i Östervåla i söndags och pratade om det här omställningstalet. Ska jag hålla det på svenska eller engelska? And then looked at the website and it had been advertised that it was going to be in English. So I thought that there might be some people who were expecting to be able to understand it without understanding Swedish. Så jag kommer säkert blanda lite, men jag tar det mest på engelska. Maybe some of you are familiar with an American writer called Wendell Berry, farmer and writer, maybe one of the sort of spiritual godfathers of something like the transition movement. And he has a poem where he says something along the lines of, "It's never wise to travel further from home than you can get back by nightfall." So thank you for bringing the llningskonferens close enough to Östervåla that I can keep Wendell's principle and get home by nightfall. I first met that poem in a book by Hine, who was the oldest friend of Ivan Illich. Illich, another kind of spiritual godfather of transition, certainly one of my spiritual godfathers, one of my elders. And Hine is farming somewhere in the US. I don't remember which state he's living in at that time in his life. And he gets an invitation from his old friend Illich to come down to Mexico and help him work on a book. And decades earlier, Hine and Illich used to travel around the world. For a few years in the 70s, Illich was on this kind of endless world tour, speaking about the things that he'd been writing about in Deschooling Society and Tools for Conviviality and Medical Nemesis and these other very important books, Energy and Equity. But by the time this invitation comes, Hine says he's found it more and more unbearable to be in the space of an airport. He's not even talking about the implications in carbon emissions. He's just talking about what that kind of space feels like, what it does to you, what it means, the rituals that you have to pass through in order to be granted access to that space, the knowledge that there are other people who, because they don't have the same little booklet in their pocket, wouldn't be allowed through those same rituals and across the same borders that you're about to be swept across at great speed. So Hine is wondering whether he can say yes to this invitation from Illich, his old friend. And he's thinking about that poem from Wendell Berry. And he thinks, is there any reason that overrides that principle of don't travel further than you can get back by nightfall? And he says, there's one, and it's friendship. Friendship is the only reason good enough to travel further than you can get back by nightfall. And so he gets on one of the long-distance buses that goes from the part of the US where he's living and farming down to Mexico, where nearly everybody else on the bus are migrant workers who come from villages in Mexico to work on farms in the US, and makes the journey to go and see his old friend and work together on the book. That came to mind as I was stepping onto the stage just now. Partly because I can see friends here in the audience. And, faces that I recognize from other places where we've been gathered together. It's good to gather like this. I want to think a little with you this morning about det goda livet, det goda mötet, det goda samtalet, and I was remembering another book from the 1970s. One or two people here might remember a book by a man called Eric Byrne called What Do You Say After You Say Hello? I remember picking up that book and reading it in my early 20s. It seemed like a helpful thing. I was quite a shy young person. And he has 2 pages at the end where he says, oh, if you picked up this book actually expecting an answer to the question, what do you say after you say hello? Here are some suggestions, having had 400 pages of very interesting, quite high-level psychological transactional analysis theory. But I was thinking about that. What do you say after you say hello? I was thinking about how good it is to be in these kinds of gatherings and how we also need other kinds of encounters, other kinds of meetings. Let's just try some hands up. Anybody here who was at the European Eco Village gathering in Ängsbacka there we go. I thought I saw a few faces I recognized from there in August. Anybody here who's ever been at a climate existence conference in Sigtuna? A few of us. Anybody here who was at the premiere of Avtryck in Stockholm that Pelle and I and a few other people here were speaking at last autumn? Anyone here who's seen Avtryck at a screening or just on your computer at home? Yeah. I remember having a wonderful evening at the screening of Avtryck and coming home and thinking about it. And I've had this conversation with Matthias, who made the film, who's a good friend. And thinking, and when I look out at the room of people who were at that screening, I was willing to bet that more than half of the people in that room had voted at the last Swedish general election for a party that got 4% of the vote. And it is important to me in the work that I'm doing and the work that Anna and I and Alfie, who is there at the book table over there, it's important not to spend too much of our time in those rooms, because this society needs more from us than that. We do get nourishment from coming together in rooms where we don't have to explain ourselves from scratch, where there are things that we can assume that we have in common. It's important to get the nourishment of that, but it's also, I think, important that our work takes us beyond the comfort zone of those spaces. And I think about this very practically because, as you've already gathered, we live in Östervåla, which has a population of 1,500. It's, I have to do the fact-checking. We have to do fact-checking in this day and age, don't we? 5 mil norr om Uppsala. And also, just before the rumor spreads, I wasn't constantly ledare at Riksteatern. I was constantly utvecklingsledare, which is a job that didn't exist before I came there and doesn't exist now. And I think was created by Måns Lagerlöf when he was teaterchef and constantly ledare, because he wanted a way to bring me into the heart of his team for a while and help bring the conversations and the questions I'd been writing about and speaking about and working with into the work of Riksteatern. So it's 3.5 years since we moved to Östervåla. We live in or above the old shoe shop. Might be 1 or 2 people here who know Östervåla as Skollundqvists, the old shoe shop that was built in 1911 and had been in the same family for 3 generations until it shut down in 2015. And in 2020, we bought it from Ulf, who's the grandson of the original shoemaker who had it built in 1911. And when you come into a place the size of Östervåla and you take on a property that anyone who grew up there has been inside because they were taken there by their parents to buy shoes when they were little, it's like you're grafting yourself onto an old tree. There's some responsibility involved in that. That's not necessarily how people always do it, but for us, certainly it feels that way. 3.5 years in, it feels like we are still in the slow journey of arriving. It takes time to arrive in a small place, doesn't it? Some of you come from places that size, you know what I'm talking about. Some of you have been through the experience of moving to somewhere that size, having come from somewhere very different. You know what I'm talking about. I have a podcast with my friend Ed Gillespie. We call our podcast The Great Humbling. That has felt like a very appropriate title under which to be working in these 3.5 years of arriving in a place the size of Uppsala. How do you arrive? How do you show up? How do you become part of a place? The first way, and this is part of what's very helpfully humbling for me about us living in Uppsala, the first way that we began to become part of the place was through Alfie, who was... How old were you, Alfie, when we moved to Uppsala? 5. Yeah, so you were in the last year of Dougald, and it was 2021, so we were in the middle of the pandemic. So the contact were kind of limited socially anyway by the pandemic. So how do you start to meet people? You meet other parents who have kids the same age. I always say when I get to go off to different countries on tour and sit in front of rooms of people and speak, it's very good for me that I go home to a place where my primary identity is Alfie's papa. Like that was the first way that anyone knew me in the place where we live. That's very grounding, that's very healthy. People in other countries who know about my work and know that I've worked a lot with the friends of Illich who wrote Deschooling Society, they say, so we know you have a kid, so are you, what kind of decisions are you making? You have this school called home, are you homeschooling? The first thing I have to explain to them, which takes them by surprise, is that homeschooling is illegal in Sweden. Isn't it interesting? People have this picture of Sweden as having been this kind of shining light of progressive, open-minded, living closer to the future than all the other countries that will be here soon. And particularly progressive folks in different parts of the world, and it shocks them when you tell them that homeschooling is illegal in Sweden. You have to explain that part of what the social democratic modernist mindset of Sweden meant is that it is culturally and socially unimaginable in Sweden that a parent could do a better job than an accredited teacher of taking responsibility for the things that a child and a young person needs to learn on their journey into society, into life. But the truth of it is, even if we had the option of homeschooling, is that really what we would do? You arrive in a new place with a population of 1,500, and your first choice is your child's going to be primarily within the home, learning with you. It would feel to me like building a 7-meter wall around the edges of our property, closing ourselves off from the community that we're in the journey of arriving into. So then instead, we have in Uppsala a school that goes from förskola through to 9. And it's to get involved, it's to try and show up to that, recognizing that that's actually one of the hubs, one of the things that weaves the community together, one of the ways in which people come to know each other and be involved in each other's lives, even while holding in view a certain skepticism about the official institutional promises of what schooling is and what it's capable of. And then maybe you try and make friends with the teachers, having an appreciation for the gap between the story of what schools are meant to be capable of doing and the reality, which is that a primary function of schools in a modern society is to provide childcare so that both parents can go out to work. And anything else that happens is a bonus. It's like, we don't admit that, but that's the reality of how we ended up with modern schooling systems. And there are wonderful people who work in schools and who break open that formal structure and make something special happen in their classrooms. I'm sure that there are some of those people in this room right now. When I came to Sweden 12 years ago, within a year or so, I went into Svenska för invandrare, went into a classroom as a beginner in a new language that was not being taught in my home language, but being taught in Swedish, where most of my friends in class that I made were Syrian and had recently arrived, having made unimaginable journeys to escape from the war that was going on in their country. Part of what I experienced was, as a privileged white person with the right passport, there are not many experiences in adult life that take you back to the sheer vulnerability that children have in a classroom where there is an adult in charge of that classroom. And I got to experience at the age of 35 things that took me back to what it had been like to be 8 years old. Patterns that I recognized, except now I could make sense of them through the lens of having read What Do You Say After You Say Hello? And all of the other adult things that had equipped me to navigate the world. And what I experienced in the classrooms of SFE, first in Stockholm, and then in Västerås, where we lived for 8 years. It didn't take me 8 years to finish SFE, by the way. But I must have had 6 or 7 different teachers over that time. And I saw that there are 3 kinds of teacher. And I remembered having had these kinds of teacher when I was 8 years old or younger or older. So there are a few teachers who, unfortunately, something has happened to them in their lives that means that they need to abuse the power that the structure of the education system gives them. And I saw that being done to refugees who were very vulnerable to whether or not this teacher signed off the piece of paper that said that they had showed up to their sessions that week. I saw the unhealthy dynamic of what was running in somebody whose life has left them needing to get some feeling of power out of being an SFE teacher in that situation. I saw the ordinary teachers who occupy the role of the power that the institutional structure gives them without abusing it. And I remembered that most of my teachers in school had been like that too. And then I had a couple of special teachers. The special teachers were the ones who didn't need the power that the role gave them and had learned some things about being human together that not only meant they didn't need it, but that they were able to put it to one side and show up as a human being with other human beings in the classroom. And that's when special things happen. And I remembered the teachers I had had between the age of 4 when we start school in England and 18 when I finished school. I remembered those individual teachers who had been like that, who for one reason or another, and they were all really different to each other, but for one reason or another, in one way or another, had found a way to turn their classrooms into a place where we meet each other and it's safe to bring more of ourselves and there is an element of play and we shift the power around and shift the roles around in the way that we spend time together. So, the school, that's the first way of us arriving. Another way of us arriving, we didn't know anything very much about Östervåla. We found this building that felt like the thing we'd been looking for years. We'd been looking for a place to call home, a place that could be a school called home. It needed to be bigger than just an ordinary domestic space, but not so big that it felt like we were rattling around inside an empty institution when it's just the 3 of us at home. And we found this shoe shop and the flat above it and the red barn in the garden, and this was right. Just we knew it. We found it on a Friday, and by the Monday night, we'd had an offer accepted on it. And then we arrive and we start to discover all these strange things about Östervåla. Maybe some of you know this. For a good number of years, from let's say the early 60s through to the beginning of the 90s, when some of the biggest musical acts in the world came to Sweden, they would play in 3 places. They'd play in the theme park in Gothenburg, they'd play in the theme park in Stockholm, Gröna Lund, and they'd play at Skogsvallen, Östervåla, population 1,500. Simon and Garfunkel played Östervåla in 1968. Miriam Makeba, you see, you didn't know this. And this is the great thing about moving to a small place. I don't think it's just Ustavola. I mean, yes, this is a particularly exceptional story. But you move to a small place, and if you arrive in the right way, all of the strangeness and all of the stories and all of the histories start coming out of the woodwork, and you get the chance to graft yourself onto those. Status Quo played in Ustavola in 1992. On YouTube, there is a TV4 5-minute film with a lot of very drunk people at a Status Quo concert in Ustavola in 1992. The Status Quo wondering quite what they are encountering in Swedish landsbygden. But there is this history. And next year, Skogsvallen will celebrate 90 years as a folkpark. And late last year, Anna and I joined the festavdelning of Ustavola idrottsförening, which runs Skogsvallen. And we, as part of that gang, we put on 5 big events this summer, and we're hoping to build it up and do more. And part of what, it's really Vanessa Andreotti, who's one of the people I've learned a huge amount from, who I first met at a climate existence conference in Sigtuna, who some of you might know as Vanessa Machado de Oliveira, because that's the name under which she wrote her book, Hospicing Modernity. One of the many, many things that I've learned from working with Vanessa is she talks about the vital compass. She says, and this comes from a Brazilian psychoanalyst called Sully Rolnick, we all have this navigational device that's located around here. It's one of the many senses that lie beyond the 5 Aristotelian senses that we're taught about in school. And you know this, because you know that there are certain settings, certain rooms, certain people in whose company you feel yourself coming alive, and there are certain settings in which you feel yourself slowly dying. We have this sense of aliveness or deadliness. Mostly our educations teach us not to take that seriously. It's not the kind of authoritative knowledge that was valued in the societies in which most of us grew up in. But it doesn't go away. It's kind of there at an animal level within us, and it's possible to learn to trust that, to learn to navigate by that. And I had that sense when I first came into one of these meetings of this committee that runs Skogsvallen, the Folkpark. Yes, there's something in me that's kind of coming alive here. It's answering something that I had realized I was longing for after that lovely event in Stockholm where we had the screening of Avtryck, but where I went away going, I don't want to be spending too much of my time in rooms where nearly everyone voted for Miljöpartiet. Because I'm sat around the table at the Skogsvallen meeting, and there's the guy who ran a bensinmacka in Sala for 30 years. And there's the guy who works at Hemköp, who's now just gone back to gymnasiet to train as an electrician. There's a woman who's a nurse. There's a guy who drives tour buses for bands, who has great contacts into the Swedish music industry. And I'm looking around and going, I don't know what party each of you voted for at the last election. I don't really mind. We're neighbours. We care about the place where we live, and we need to figure out how to make it a good place to live. And I'm really glad to be in a room that has that shape, as well as some of the other rooms that I'm glad to get to spend part of my time in. And it's also humbling because each of them has more practical skills to bring to the table in running a folk park. I spent 6 months coming to those meetings, struggling to keep up with the speed of Föreningssverige, mötesprotokoll, and find my words and join in, but also going, where do I fit in? Where do I become useful in this setting? And that's quite helpful. That's quite humbling. Anna becomes useful straight away because she's worked in Kommunsverige for 12 years, and that immediately makes you very helpful to a förening that needs at times to interface with official structures. The moment where I realized that I could be useful rather than just appreciating getting to tag along and being part of the gang was when we were sat in a meeting and talking about the need for a poster, and I get Canva up on my web browser and start sketching out the poster, and everyone starts looking and going, what is this magic that he's doing? I'm not a graphic designer. It has never been a part of my identity that I am the guy who makes beautiful posters. I'm not making great claims for the quality of the graphic design of the posters that I make for Skogsvallen, but it turns out that that was where I had enough skill that no one else around the table had to make myself useful. That's kind of helpfully humbling as well. And you know, the whole journey of arriving, especially as somebody for whom Swedish is my second language, and where words are my skill and my craft, arriving in a small place, you know, it's partly learning that how I show up isn't all about what I say. It's about what people see me do. It's about what people recognize about my willingness to show up and not get in the way and hang around until I find something useful that I can contribute with. I'm never, Anna's never, maybe Alfie will, in some ways, be from Östervåla in the way that some people are from Östervåla. There are families that have been there for generations. You can see their family names in the churchyard. Everyone knows who they are and who they're related to, and they're part of the informal power structures of a community of that size. And that's okay. That's part of how humans make lives together. But I can become part of Östervåla if I'm willing to show up in a way that shows that I don't think I know everything and have all the answers. If I'm willing to make a fool of myself and muck in. And, you know, it's also like going to the church across the road most Sundays. That's another part of it. And I was having a conversation after church a couple of weekends ago with a guy in his 70s, and he was asking me about what I write. And I realized that often when I try and answer that question, I put up the 7-meter wall around myself. Jag skriver om miljöfrågor, men med ganska filosofisk och kulturinriktning. Hey, I can feel myself dying when I try and describe what I do that way. And it's partly because I have a story which says that outside of rooms like this, what I do is alienating to people and not interesting to them. I'm like, no, that's not actually true. That's not actually the whole story. And I found myself saying to him, jag skrev om hur vi kommer klara framtiden. Och att det kanske finns saker som vi behöver från hur vi gjorde, hur vi klarade livet förut. Och det är inte att vi ska försöka gå tillbaka till någonting, för det går inte. Men att vi behöver ta med oss saker som vi kanske inte har uppskattat i det moderna samhället. And then I see him leaning in and I'm leaning in, and we're starting to find somewhere where we meet. It's taken me 3.5 years to arrive at the point where I'm beginning to have a story of my work that I can tell my neighbors in a way that doesn't feel like I'm kind of hiding from myself because I can't make it work. That's humbling, but that's also part of it. And, you know, and so here comes the question, which is why haven't we started llningskonferens? And I was thinking about this, and I was thinking, I know the people who would show up if we started that, and we've met those people. Like, we find each other, don't we? The people within, especially in smaller communities. In a big city, it's different. But in a small place, it's not hard to find the people who would show up to the Omsta meeting. And then I remembered my friend Jocke Rindor, who I worked with at Riksteatern, and he was working on a project called Livet inuti, which was about growing up queer in landsbygden, in rural Sweden, which is part of his own story. So it was very close to his heart, this project. And he was out doing research in Norrland for this production. And he told me a story. He said, you know, he was going around and talking to people and going, so who should I meet? Whose stories could help us tell this story? And particularly, and this is a very Omsta thing to talk about, he wanted to tell a story from a queer perspective that complicated the story that has often been told, with good reason, about how you grow up miserably being queer in a small place in a country like Sweden, and then you move to the big city and you find your people, and you can breathe and you can be who you actually are. And he wanted to tell a story that said, yes, that has been part of plenty of people's experience, and there are reasons for that, but it's not the whole story. And so he was looking for people with other stories about being queer in rural Sweden. And one of the things that happened, several people said to him, you have to go to that cafe. And it was in like a place with 6 or 7 houses on a road that has quite a bit of traffic coming through it. There's this little coffee shop, and there's the 2 guys who run it together. And he goes and talks to them. And he said, they said to me, everyone knows who we are. Everyone knows we're a couple. No one's actually ever given us any shit about it. It would never occur to us to hang a rainbow flag outside the cafe. And in a big city, you do. It can be the right thing. It can be a good thing to hang the rainbow flag outside the cafe. Because in a big city, everyone's kind of lost and lonely, and you need to raise a flag to find each other. In smaller places, you don't need those ways of finding each other. You don't always need the badge of an organization, of a movement. And it might be, for some of us anyway, that the work is to create other contexts to which people show up who wouldn't come to the Omsta meeting. I find myself saying, när krisen kommer, vill man bara känna de som kom till omställningsmötet? Oh, I'm not sure. I think I want to know the guy who ran the petrol station for 30 years. I want to know the guy who works for Svenska kyrkan with Skog and knows how to drive big machines. There are a lot of people carrying a lot of knowledge and skills and practical experience that maybe doesn't have as high status as the things that I've been praised for in my life, but who might have more to bring to the table when the shit hits the fan. I don't need necessarily all of those people to be deeply oriented to climate change and peak oil right now. What I do need is to know them, to be friends with them, to have spent time doing things together where we got to know each other. And in that, some of them get more curious about, someone comes to an event that we do in the shoe shop and then comes back 2 days later and knocks on the door because they've gone away and Googled us and found about my book and they want to buy a copy. Great. But the event, and this is slightly swearing in church here, but, and I was in the UK starting Dark Mountain in 2009 at the point where the transition movement had just kind of really blossomed into life in the UK. And there was a lot of real good friendship and collaboration and dialogue in those early years of Dark Mountain, between Dark Mountain and transition. Charlotte Ducan, who is the co-director and editor of Dark Mountain these days, she was the editor of the Transition Free Press, the transition newspaper that existed for 3 years in the UK. That's how close the relationships are between transition and Dark Mountain, the movement that I was partially responsible for starting. But these days, I have people who do the online courses that Anna and I run with a school called Hine, and who get really into my work and the work of other people who they've been introduced to through our online series, and they'll say to me, so I want to start something where I live, and I'm thinking of having a book group around At Work in the Ruins or around hospicing modernity. And I say, please don't. I don't think that's the place to start. This is the swearing in church bit. I'm not convinced that the place to start is to screen a documentary about climate change and peak oil. I'm not convinced that the place to start is always, anyway, from informing and educating. It might be if you're already deeply rooted in and in relation in your community, you might be the right person to do that. But I think often the place to start is building relations. And not just as a means to an end, but as the heart of Dougald, as the heart of what matters and what's going to get us through as times get harder. So I say to people, like, have you got a friend who's a musician? How about you do like a house concert in your living room? Or how about, if you've got a garden where you've got like a crazy amount of apples? Don't know if anyone relates to this right now in Sweden. Crazy amount of apples on your trees. How about you just invite anyone who doesn't have a garden but lives in the place where you live to come over, and you do a big day of picking and cooking with the apples together. And this is, we say our school, a school called home. It consists of a kitchen table and a story. We always say it's a school that starts from the conversations Anna and I bring together around our kitchen table. And whatever else it is, it spreads out from and returns to that scale, that intimacy, that centering of hospitality and conviviality. And one of the things that's happened since 2020 is that it has spread and come to life online and very internationally. And there are probably some people in this room, but there are people all over the world who've taken part in these online series that we do twice a year, where we gather people for 5 weeks, once a week, around these kinds of questions. But one of the things I've seen in those series is that people usually arrive as individuals who've been drawn to my work. Maybe they've watched a video, they've seen me do a talk, they've read the book or whatever. Over the weeks, they realize that that's less interesting than the other people who've shown up. So I'm just acting as the excuse. Our dear friend, the artist Caroline Ross, who's going to be doing some events with Ingrid Riese and Isak Stoddard near Uppsala soon. Caroline taught Anna and me a phrase from her Tai Chi tradition. She says, in our tradition, we talk about using the false to cultivate the real. Using the false, den falska, to cultivate the real, det verkliga. And what that means is, or what that means to her is, the heart of the tradition, the real, is not easy to explain. It's not something you can put on a poster and put up on the board out there with a slot in the week when you can come to the Tai Chi class and you will get this. You can't promise that someone coming to the class will get the heart of the tradition. The heart of the tradition is a deep, old understanding of a way of being in the world. The false is a set of moves that you can learn if you come to class. As a teacher, you can offer to teach that set of moves because that's a fair exchange you can make for money with a stranger. Whether the deep currents within that transition get transmitted to that student is something that you cannot make a matter of transactional exchange. You can't promise that that's going to be about. You can't even explain it to someone who hasn't hung out long enough to begin to notice that there's something else, something deeper going on that's powering what you practice through practicing these sequences of movements. And she says, it's really important to figure out what your false is. The false is not bad. The false is in resonance with the real, but it's the expression of the real that is on the surface that you can offer to a stranger and take money from them, and that's been a fair deal. The real is the thing that matters most, the treasure within your practice, within your tradition, within what you're doing. So what I've gradually realized is that in our work as the school, I'm the false. People come because they go, oh, great, I can spend 5 weeks doing this thing with Dougald Hine. The real is what begins to emerge in the relationships that are formed when people start to get interested in the things that other people say, start to meet each other, start to get in touch with each other outside of the sessions. Lots of people stay on and are part of the long table, our ongoing community for those who are drawn to the work of regrowing a living culture. And what I see is people finding the courage and finding the moves to step into their version of what we're doing with the shoe shop or with gathering people around the kitchen table or whatever. It's practicing being human together. It's remembering how to be human together, because collectively we got out of practice at this in modernity. For a few generations, it was possible to organize our lives through the power of the market and the state to such an extent that we forgot that there are other ways in which humans can come together and do things. We got rusty. It's like a muscle that we haven't been using, and so it's kind of withered. But the muscle is still structurally there within the kind of creatures that we are. It's possible to exercise it. It's possible to build it up again. What is that muscle? Gustavo Esteva, who was the first person who ever talked to me about Buen Vivir, about De Goede Livet, was an amazing Mexican activist and deprofessionalized intellectual, advisor to the Zapatistas, friend of Ivan Illich. I used to spend time with him in Mexico, and he said to me one time, Dougald, if you want to talk to people about the commons, especially in Europe, especially in cities, you need to talk about friendship. And it took me 2 years of chewing on that. Why did he say that? You know, I asked him in the interview where he said that, you know, given the scale of the trouble we're in, given how frightening what we know and what we have grounds to fear about climate change is, if I go back and say to people, friendship is where we need to start from, that's going to sound very fragile, very small. What I understood after 2 years of sitting with that, knowing that there was something in it, I went, okay. Friendship is one of the few places where we still have a common language for recognizing that the world is not simply made up of resources. A resource is something to exploit. And very often, even commons have been redescribed to us as ways of managing resources. We know Elinor Ostrom's work, very important work, but it's an approximation. What a commons historically has really been is something that you're not to treat as a resource. Ivan Illich talks about this in a short text called Silence is a Commons. He says the commons was that which lay beyond the garden, beyond the immediate plot on which somebody lived, to which, as a member of that community, you had a right of access. And he says, you know, the law of the commons was a law that was never written down, both because it was too complex to fit into paragraphs and because people didn't need to write it down. It was a law that was held in the fabric of culture, in the fabric of community. Everyone knew that there were different things that different people at different seasons could do with this patch of shared land, this commons, this allmänning. But what you couldn't do was take from it for the market. You could take for your own needs, but you couldn't take from it for the market. It's not hard to understand. You know, if you stayed like I did, like me and Alfie did at the hostel by the station in town this morning, you have that you know, one of the few Swedish words that's made it into English, the smorgasbord. And we all know that you can go back and take as much as you can eat from it, but you can't set up a little table on the street outside and take from it and sell to passers-by. It's not hard. Like, this logic is very, very intuitive, but it has been erased by the market and the state, and by the interests that are served by the market and the state from our culture, to the point where you have to try and explain it with theory in ways that, you know, you're probably not going to get very far if you try and sit down and have that conversation with your neighbors. But friendship, when it comes to friendship, we still have a language for talking about this. If somebody who I thought was a friend treats me as a resource, I say, I feel used, and everybody knows what I mean. I don't have to explain it with theory and history and the rest of the stuff that I love talking about, but that isn't always helpful. And that's become really important to me, to look for those. They're called commonplaces, actually. There's an old language for this in English. A commonplace was something that you learned when you trained in rhetoric in the way that people used to in the Middle Ages. If you belonged to that minority of people who were having formal education in the world of the Middle Ages, then one of the things you studied was rhetoric, and one of the things you learned in rhetoric was topoi, places or commonplaces. The commonplaces are the things where someone who's not coming from the same frame of reference that you're coming from will recognize in their own experience something that you can talk about. So friendship as a way of talking about commons is an example of that. Looking for the commonplaces, the meeting points between our experience. And I think this is really important because I think we're headed into a time where the stuff that is carried in a movement like transition is ripe for a lot more people to need to know about. But we need to find ways of meeting people where they're coming from. We need to find the boundary objects and the commonplaces, the ways into conversations. You know, a few years ago, I felt like the language of transition had been totally co-opted. Mostly when I heard transition outside of a room like this, I was hearing it used to talk about the energy transition. It was basically the Tesla transition. We're going to swap out the fossil fuels for electricity. Mumble, mumble, the electricity is going to come from somewhere. Electricity isn't a fuel. And it's all going to be fine. And I feel like even in Sweden today, we're crossing a threshold where it's becoming common sense to say, no, like we were sold a pup. That's not true. That story isn't going to be realized. And when you see what's happening with Northvolt, part of what that means is that people who 3 or 5 years ago were completely sold on the promise of the Tesla transition are coming unsold from it. It's easier to have conversations about we're not going to be able to solve all of this with technology, clever hacks and fixes. The fact that Elon Musk has shown himself to be the kind of character that he is also part of why the promise of the Tesla transition has come unstuck. And it was always deeply flawed, even when it sounded more convincing to more people than it does today. Part of what never made sense about the Tesla transition is that it was premised on the idea that the only thing that was wrong with the way we were living was our resource use and our carbon emissions. And if you could fix those things, it would all be great. We'd be in Hans Rosling and Steven Pinker world. And it's not that there was no truth in the stories that Rosling used to tell. It's that you had to leave out too much in order to reduce the whole of human history to that up and to the right curving graph in the TED Talk. Too much loss had to be left out of the story in order to make it work that way. And part of why there are so many dark forces politically in our societies today is because unacknowledged loss, ungrieved loss goes septic, goes toxic, brews into something very dark. And the responsibility for that does not just lie with the obvious people on that side of the political spectrum. It lies with those on the rest of the political spectrum who made no room for acknowledging the extent of loss within our societies. I find it very striking. I was thinking about this when I was traveling in the United States last month. I find it very striking how almost all of the great success stories of the 21st century so far in mainstream culture, the businesses that have been real breakthroughs, the innovations, are ways of numbing ourselves. Whether it's Netflix or opioids, the legalization of cannabis, ketamine. It's astonishing how many of the trends of the early 21st century are ways for people to numb themselves. I think that tells us something about just how close to the edge mainstream society and mainstream culture is, just how dysfunctional it is, and just how far people are experiencing the dysfunctionality of that in their bodies and in their lives, even if they don't have a language for talking about it. Part of why they don't have a language for talking about it is because we've been told for so long that the way that some of us have been living around here lately is Dougald or leave it, is the best way that humans have ever lived. And we're so lucky to have been born in the West, in the global North, in the late 20th century or the early 21st century. too much was left out of that story. I'll tell you one more story, and then we must be out of time, but then we're going to do some other things together and have some time for questions and so on. But it relates to that numbing. Vanessa, who I mentioned before, Vanessa Andreotti, who wrote Hospicing Modernity, told me about a young person that she was working with in Canada, a teenager who'd been self-harming. And they went together to one of the First Nations communities that Vanessa's collective, the Gesturing Towards Decolonial Futures collective, works with. And they took the pain that this girl was in and talked about it with the elders. And what the girl said was, I feel like my school counselor has been telling me to stop feeling the pain of the world. And that can't be right. And this was a young person who was saying, I can't see a world worth living for. Can't see a reason to stay alive given all that I can see of what's going on in the world today. And there are so many people in our societies, young and not so young, who are in that place, aren't there? And she said, and that can't be right. It feels like they're telling me they need to, I should amputate my heart, like amputating a limb. A few weeks later, they went back, and the elders had been sitting with this, and the message that they brought back was, they said, it seems to us that where you come from, people have forgotten that the heart is a thing that scales. It doesn't scale up, it scales out. So, yes, if you try and feel all the pain of the world in the heart on the scale of me on my own, it will break you. But there is also the scale of me and you. There's the scale of us all together. There's the scales of us with all of the other creatures, the more than human companions in this piece of ground that we are meeting on today. There are other scales of the heart. And if we don't remember that, we will be stuck needing to numb ourselves with Netflix and all of the rest of the products that the billionaires have been making lots out of in the early 21st century. Another story that comes from the same sequence of encounters with this First Nations community, after some groups that had come from the university where Vanessa works had been there on the reservation, a message came back from the elders. They said, we need to send a message because we're concerned. It seems to us that where you come from, people only know one way of dealing with what has happened to them in their lives. We might use the word trauma for what has happened to them in their lives. That was what they were talking about. And it seems to us, they said, that the way that you know of dealing with what's happened in your life is that everyone needs to sit down and listen while one person tells the whole story of what has happened to them. And they said, we're worried. We're worried that there isn't time. And we want to send a message that there are other ways of dealing with what has happened to you. Other ways of dealing with the grief and loss and the things that you weren't given, the things that were done to you. And they said, and one of those is ceremony. There are ways of being together that allow a lot of things to happen, allow a lot to be released, a lot to be changed. And although this wasn't spelt out, I don't think the message was, so we need you all to come to Sundance next year. I don't think that would be a helpful way of taking up the invitation that was carried in that message. I think the invitation was, go back to your own cultures. Look at the ways of being human together, the ways of gathering, and not just from your distant ancestors on whom it's easy to project all kinds of wish fulfillment of what your ancestral practices and traditions are, but your more recent ancestors, the ones you have troubled relationships with, the ones who, for good reasons, you may have difficulty with the practices, the ceremonies that mattered to them and were part of how their lives were structured. But go looking for what has been forgotten within your culture about the ways in which those ceremonies allow us to scale the heart, allow us to hold the loss, the grief, the trauma, the things that were done to us, the things that we weren't given, the times when we weren't fed. You know, that saying, if you haven't been fed, become bread. The invitation at the heart of the work we're doing with the school is into ways of showing up where you find yourself, where it might just be possible that you can turn your life into a gift. You can make a gift even out of the bad things that happen to you, even out of the loss and the grief. There are ways in which that can become part of what's needed, part of what's called for in the times around and ahead of us. And Dougald it isn't all about the happy times. Sometimes what brings you together is the shit that happens in community. You know, the horrible things that people do are what call on you to show up, to notice how much you care about the people that you've been getting to know in the 3.5 years since you arrived in a small place, about the place itself, which includes the people who might be the ones who are causing that shit, but you still have to figure out how to live together, how to make lives together, how to make it a good place to live. There's so much that's held in spaces like this, in movements like transition, that is needed in our communities. Adam Wilson from the Peasantry School says he spent years visiting and studying intentional communities. And at a certain point, he had this image that came to him like a vision. He said, the intentional community is a community where we stand in a circle and we're all holding hands and looking inwards. But what's called for now might be that we drop our hands, turn 180 degrees, then take up the hands again, but this time we're facing outwards. And yes, the children might be inside that circle where we're facing outwards. The vulnerable might be inside that circle where we're facing outwards, but that's the challenge. That's the invitation for movements like Omsta today, is how do we face outwards? How do we find the courage to show up to the people who won't ever come to our meetings, not asking them to simply come and be informed by us, or to make sense of everything that's going on in the world in the language that we might use in those meetings, but to find together new words, new language, new images by which we can make sense of what's called for by all of the loss that is running in the background of our societies.